Well, joining me now is Phil Wheatley, retired Director General of the Prison Service. Very good morning to you. So what do you make of those urgent changes by the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, then? You know, 40 inmates moved out of Wandsworth prison immediately to other prisons and an extra governor. The right response?
It sounds like there's been a careful consideration of the best way of improving things at Wandsworth. Wandsworth was under pressure. It was running near to maximum capacity, and it had less than the required number of staff for looking after the prisoners. And it was experiencing difficulty in doing that. The danger of that is that when a prison's in crisis because there aren't enough staff, too many prisoners, there are a number of incidents taking place because of that, usually leads to an increase in suicide attempts, an increase in violence in the establishment. That distracts both managers and some of the concentration away from security to trying to deal with the incidents. And by reducing the numbers in the prison, it'll make it easier to manage and easier to match the number of staff to the number of prisoners. So this should help Wandsworth get back to operating properly with careful attention to all the security processes, which is what security depends on. It's endless, relentless, careful work with no gaps in it. And distractions and too many crises make it much more difficult for governors to get that constant attention to get the right security delivered properly.
The whole case has really opened up a conversation about prison reform in this country. And there was someone this morning that said, actually, Wandsworth Prison should just be closed, opened up as a museum, perhaps, because if you look at the paper, you know, you've got more prisoners sharing cells. It's a Victorian, rodent-infested place. How do you change that balance? Because there is clearly a problem with recruiting staff.
Well, it's a very difficult balance to change without lots of investment. The government knew that the prison population was growing. It is forecast to continue growing. And unfortunately, the delivery of places to cope with that growing population and the staff to supervise it are both running behind where they should be. So we've been putting prisoners into police cells for nearly a year now because of the excess demand for prison places. It's highly undesirable, distracts the police from doing their proper job, and isn't the best way of looking after prisoners sent by the courts to prison, not to police cells. But it shows what a state of crisis the situation is, and the shortage of staff in hard-to-recruit areas where there's a buoyant economy around about, lots of other competitors looking for the same sort of people, has made it very difficult, despite a lot of effort, to get staffing levels up to the basic level for just delivering an ordinary regime properly. So that requires investment. It's a competitive market. It's recruiting people, and if UKBA are paying more, or the police are paying more, then the chances are that a number of staff will think, I can go and work somewhere else, probably with slightly less risk, and I can get a job there that pays me better.
Phil, when you saw the news breaking about Daniel Khalife's escape, what did you think about numbers? Do you think there weren't enough staff working that day that led to this happening?
No, I don't think it's as simple as that. I think what I described earlier is the sort of thing that will have happened simply because the prison has been in a state of crisis. The attention that's needed by managers to making sure that everything works right gets distracted by simply having to deal with the crisis. If there's a suicide, there's lots of follow-up work to do to try and correct the things that are wrong, to deal with relatives, to find out what happened. It absorbs lots of management effort. And so if you're running a prison which, because it's unsafe, because the numbers are high and the staff not sufficient to look after them, then both managers and staff will get distracted by the events that shortage of staff and high numbers of prisoners produces. So I don't know what the staffing levels were on the day, but I do know that Wandsworth has been chronically short of staff, as are many of the other London prisons for some time. Some of that's being backfilled by bringing staff down country on short periods from easier to recruit areas on what's called detached duty. But they're staff who don't know the prison, and it takes a bit before you learn how the regime works here, how the layout works. You know the prisoners know you and know that you're a member of staff who's to be respected, you know your stuff. And so people who just come on the short term may fill a space, but they're not really doing the job that permanent staff who know the place well will do.
It's a tough question, Phil, but if you were back in the job, what would you do to turn things around? There's a recent report that said, 30% of staff don't turn up to work, and this is a constant problem. How do you go about changing attitudes? Because clearly it's a mix of there not being enough staff on the job or inexperienced staff. How do you go about changing that?
It would be very difficult for me if I came back, and I'm not volunteering to come back. I'm, in a way, quite pleased I'm retired, to lead a change without a lot of investment from the government. The government do need to produce enough prison places with the staff to staff those places for the population they expect to have. It is madness to run the prison service on absolutely maximum capacity with no leeway whatsoever, because when something goes wrong, the system can't cope. It's like running your car constantly with the rev counter on red. You wouldn't do it. You know eventually that will cause breakdown. So we really ought to have a better match of population, which is there are projections which tell you what it's likely to be, and they're fairly accurate, certainly in the short term. The government can plan for that, and the long-term projections give you a clear view of what the expectations are for the future. And recruiting staff depends upon terms and conditions being competitive, and that's difficult for a government who are trying to fight inflation and are trying to use the public sector pay settlements to make sure they don't fuel inflation. But actually, the public sector are in competition with other public sector bodies and the private sector. And if pay is dropping behind in real terms, or other people can get other jobs that pay better and give them interesting work, they will vote with their feet, particularly if prisoners have become unsafe, which means that the job is probably dangerous for staff, and the chances of being assaulted as a member of staff are roughly 3 times what they were when I left the prison service. It's not because I left the prison service, it's because they're doing a job under great pressure, and that puts staff under more physical threat than they were in steadier times, with a better balance of the number of prisoners and the number of staff, and a more permanent staff who weren't churning around and leaving at the rate that the current staff are.
OK, well, we'll leave it there, but great to talk to you. That's Phil Wheatley, retired Director General of the Prison Service.